Hello friends, my name's Steven, and I've made a series of videos over the past decade talking about recovery from ankylosing spondylitis, and it's 2024 in July. People have been asking me for years how I'm doing and to make an update, and I keep forgetting to do so, so I thought I would make one. And the long story short is I'm doing fantastic with AS. I've been in remission 95% of the time for the last 3 years. And if you don't want to hear a whole story about how that came to be, the basic thing that I'm doing right now, physiologically and biologically, is first with my diet. I just eat ground beef and certain kinds of cheeses. So I've been doing that since January 2021. So 3.5 years of beef. I don't quite have, my frame isn't big enough for me to just be a Hulk, but it's been it's been great for my health otherwise. And then I've also I walk like 5 miles a day, and I live on the road. This is my little home, my camper home. So I spend a lot of time in the sunshine. But really, I've been doing the walking and sunshine and all that for a long time. Really, it's the extreme diet that I'm doing. And when I say ground, like just beef, certain kinds of cheeses, like white cheeses, but even there, I only do like white cheddar and Monterey Jack. And salt, I really mean just that. So there's been periods where I eat a little bit of fish and maybe some pork rinds with just salt, but I tend, a lot of, when I've tried other things, even spices, I've flared again, and other stuff just makes me sick in other ways. So it's really just been that. And I've had, and actually it's not a burden to me anymore. I mean, partly eating that kind of strict way isn't a burden because I don't have much of a social life. I haven't been out to dinner in 6 or 7 years because I live by myself on the road, which was by choice, So it hasn't been hard to break that in terms of my social life. It is expensive, but I buy the cheapest stuff I can find that's of relative quality. But anyways, that's where I landed, y'all, since 2021. And things have been, for the vast majority of time, have been in remission. But the story is, I first made a video back in 2012. I think that was like 12 years ago. And I got AS in 2008. It's in my family, so I have the gene and stuff too. Anyways, I was pretty sick after about 4 years from 2008 to 2012. And at that time, I made my first video called Recovery from Ankylosing Spondylitis, where I talked about a diet, a no-starch diet, but I also limited other things. And I also ate a few what I was calling safe starches per this book called The Perfect Health Diet, where I was eating white potatoes and white rice. Back then, and I did antibiotic. I've, like a lot of people, I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars on different treatments. I've tried everything. I've eaten every supplement in the world. I've gotten obscure things from China that come in unmarked boxes and eaten things that say don't eat. I've drinking an industrial solvent at one point. So that's serious. So I've been through the ring, trying to figure out things. That first video, I was in recovery. So I shared my story. I shared an update in 2014 after I had a relapse. After about 6 weeks, I was able to get back on track. That was virally related. I got sick with some kind of parasite, probably from drinking river water that wasn't quite filtered. And then my last video was 2018, so this was 6 years ago, and I had gotten very sick again. And I'm sorry to report that from 2016 to 2021, the beginning of it, I grew increasingly sick and unwell. Culminating in 2020 being like beyond, like I've lost words for how, what that was like. I had spinal fusion. I ended up in the hospital because I couldn't walk. I developed other autoimmune conditions. And I came to realize that what set all of that off, because I I'd been doing the same diet and stuff. So something changed. Was I had for work, I went overseas in 2016, and I got a series of, to protect you against viruses. And as a lot of people with autoimmune diseases understand, there's risks in that. So I got 3 of those. A couple weeks later, autoimmune disease starts to get active again. I probably got a virus when I was overseas as well. The combination of all of that, my immune system went out of control. And then at that stage, I couldn't get back into any kind of remission. I was in constant flare cycles, and I might come out for a few days and then it would hit me for a week. And this was, it was the whole, it was my neck, my ribs. When I was hospitalized, it was my knee turned that big. It was the whole shebangum, and all the colorful varieties of pain that if I was more of a poet, I would have words for. But I was trying things like, eating only ground beef at that time, fasting for long periods of time, lots of antibiotics and all this different kind of stuff. And I just couldn't get out of flare after flare after flare after flare. So now that I'm in remission, I've been in remission for a few years, I look back at that. I'm not sure there was anything actually I could do for those few years where things were a hellscape. It might have just been that my immune system was so activated and whacked out that that there was simply nothing that could be done, and I just had to wait it out with time, which is a discouraging thing to say. But I've got a bad case of this, and not everybody has a really bad case of it, so other people have different paths. But yeah, 2020 was the worst. I was going to do a fecal transplant, eating someone else's poop and stuff, and I was going to do that officially, but it was very expensive if you're going to do it above ground. The Taymount Clinic, I think, I talked to them and stuff, but they don't, anyways, I was at that level of just replacing my whole microbiome. I've been doing a lot of fast. It's just whatever I could do, but I really couldn't, but couldn't get out of it. But it was right. It was starting in January 2021. I had been pretty despondent for 6 months. And so, I kind of got suicidal for a while, and then, which, sucked, but I've worked in mental health for 20 years. I'm used to it. And when I got through it, or I didn't really quite get through it, but when I got to the end of 2020, I said, I've got to give, if I'm thinking about dying anyways, I got to give one last shot. So that's when I decided I was going to just be extreme. And so starting January 2021, I didn't really have the energy because I got skin autoimmune disorders now. That probably came from a cortisol shot that I got in 2020 for my knee. As y'all know, autoimmune diseases bleed over. You end up with all kinds of different things a lot of the time. They're quite fun. They're quite humbling. And yeah, I somehow found the energy January 2021 where I got really disciplined with, walking 5 miles a day, no matter what. I was doing yoga type stuff, stretching, a lot of breath work, and and I wasn't working at the time because of COVID, and I was too disabled to work in 2020. So anyway, I had some time to rest, and I was doing all that. But the main thing was I went ground beef only, and I did ground beef only for 6 months. And friends, I started noticing, started feeling better about a week into that, but it took 6 months of just ground beef and salt. Nothing else. No experimentation. In terms of supplements, trace minerals, and I do take a multivitamin. This is one that I found I can tolerate. That's it though, right? Nothing else. Because anything, when your immune system is that sensitive and in that kind of a bad place, anything can set things off. Took 6 months of just ground beef. But I woke up one day on a river up in northern Montana, and I said, oh my gosh, I'm not in pain this morning. It was just this gradual thing. So at that stage, a couple months after, so I was like, let's just keep it. Let's see if we can keep this. Kept that, no pain for a few months. I said, boy, man, it's hard, especially living on the road, to have to cook. Because I was only doing ground beef too, no steaks, none of this expensive stuff that makes it fun. But cooking that every day, you know, if it's windy outside, you can't really cook. So I had to get up at 6 in the morning sometimes and take my stove into like an arroyo when I was in the desert. In between, like the wind's blowing everywhere and I'm trying to cook and the grease is flying on my face and the cast iron and stuff. So it was a pain to just eat ground beef because I don't have an apartment kind of thing. But yeah, I rode out with that for a couple months. But I was like, so I really hope I can just eat one other thing, preferably something I don't have to cook. So that's when I started reintroducing cheeses. I did it very slow. And I knew I wanted to do only white cheeses because of, I don't want the annatto, which is a seed that's used for coloring. And also I did white cheeses because, I made sure to do the ones that were more aged. So I started with sharp white cheddar. Apparently the more aged they are, the less lactose, that kind of thing. So I was doing cheeses that were aged like a year or two. Like I said in the beginning, I've eventually been able to incorporate other kinds of white cheeses, although I still don't eat soft white, or really soft white cheeses because they have some sugary stuff. So once I was able to get cheese back in there, I definitely noticed that I didn't have as much energy once I reincorporated cheese. Cheese makes me tired, and because I'm only eating beef and cheese, I mean, we're talking about like I buy those big blocks and I sit down and I eat the whole thing. So I think I counted at one point I was doing like 4,000 calories a day, you know, because I walk a lot and all that. So I'd eat that much and then, you know, or if it's in the middle of the day. So I can't say that emotionally, spiritually, all that adding cheese back was, you know, made me feel better in those respects. But cheese is very satisfying. It's very easy to eat. When it's raining outside and I can't cook, I can just spend a few days just subsisting off of cheese. And yeah, it makes me tired. It's worth it for me. So fine. So as long as I don't have the pain. So in this last period of time, I would say there's been a couple of times I've had a flare and I've been able to find the culprit. So again, I've learned a lot from that. So the last time I had a flare was in April, and I had an actual major flare. It was the worst one I'd had since 2020. And that I got really, really sick this past April with some kind of respiratory virus. I was coughing up blood. It could have very well been COVID. It might have been pneumonia, RSV, who knows? I don't generally get sick. So I'm thinking maybe COVID or something, which I've gotten before. And so anyways, yeah, coughing up blood, got really sick, taking antibiotics, just in case it was one of these RSV and stuff, which is always dangerous, taking antibiotics when your microbiome's so involved with your immune system. And, you know, antibiotics are not really specific. They go in there and nuclearize the entire terrain, and you don't know what's going to happen. So I blew up into a massive flare. And for the next 3 weeks, I ate nothing but cheese. Because occasionally, I'm like, beef, you know, so I ate nothing but cheese. I stopped taking the antibiotics. Anyways, I got back to remission. But it took a few weeks. And I had to be, this is what I've learned, I had to be 100% disciplined. When I went back into that flare, if I so much as ate a few little sprinklings of pepper, I could throw the whole thing off for months. I'm convinced of this. You know, maybe I'm a madman at this point. But I've just had so many experiences like this that I've learned, especially when you're in the vulnerable state of a flare, for me at least, I have to do everything right. There's no exception, right? Like, just cannot make a mistake because the mistakes cascade or they amplify. Like a little mistake. And that, not to get all nerdy, but in systems theory, really interesting stuff, also sometimes called complexity theory. You know, there's all this stuff about how natural systems work, like how a forest works, but also how a body works and how a biome works, like an ecosystem. And one of the things that's learned from there is a system, so like a body or a forest, can absorb new things and things that could be trauma. So like in a forest, an invasive species, they can often absorb it. But too much of that, or the wrong kind, you hit a point which is called a critical threshold. So my body got the virus. It was trying to get rid of it, but I took the antibiotics. The virus is getting worse. I'm coughing. You know, at a certain point, I hit the critical threshold. And at that point, a system goes into a state where it's either going to reorganize into a place that's going to have health, but also with a little more resiliency because you've just been through something, or it's going to collapse and go into a really bad state. So my immune system's either going to get through it and strengthen a little bit, or I'm going to go into hell. Hello, devil. So one or the other. It's called a bifurcation point. At that critical threshold, very small things, so this applies for a forest and a body, very small things can have huge outsized effects. So complexity theory famously talks about, like, if a butterfly flaps her wings in Argentina, it can cause a tornado in China. And the point is, everything's interconnected. But when the system is in a vulnerable state, very, very small things, a sprinkling of pepper, can have huge outsized effects. So being in a flare is a vulnerable state. It's often a bifurcation point. This is how I've come to think of it. So at that stage, it's 100% has to be perfect, whatever you do. For me, at least. So anyways, so got through that, right. And so the last few months have been just in remission, the same way I had for the past few years. So that's where I'm at. I've had a lot of, I've had a religious conversion in my life in the last few years. Which has been very interesting. In some ways it's made my life harder, but in some ways it's, it's just helped me align with what I believe is true more, and that's been beautifying and important and deepening and that kind of stuff. And that's the sort of thing I found, that there's almost psychic space for when in remission. Although I think sometimes in your worst suffering is when you have the most kind of spiritual experiences. It's very hard to get to a truth without going through suffering, which in Christianity, the cross is what you go through. The suffering is what you go through for resurrection. So, right, so there's a spiritual aspect to being in the hell of pain and all that too. But I would not underappreciate how wonderful it is when if you can reach a point of remission from autoimmune disease and basically have that in check. So to all of you, Godspeed, keep trying things. There's a Facebook group with like 15,000 people doing, I think it's called the low starch diet. I don't really do Facebook anymore, but when I used to, all those people were doing dietary stuff and having remission. So y'all, this is not some hidden secret anymore. There's information. In 2012, there was like a couple dozen of us. This is all out there. And so the information is out there. Yeah, it's hard work, but man, is it worth it to get to a place where you don't have pain. And most importantly, you're not fusing anymore. Your bone, you're not turning into that, all that kind of stuff. So Godspeed, be well.